They found the baby 3 miles away, sitting unharmed in the top of an elm tree. They found the parents buried under 3 tons of courthouse brick. In 1880, an F4 tornado didn't just kill you, it played games with you. Imagine if 10% of New York City died in 10 minutes. That is 800,000 people. That is the scale of what happened to Marshfield, Missouri on April 18th. It remains one of the deadliest localized weather events in American history. And the scary part? They were watching the clouds, and they still didn't see it coming. On a quiet Sunday in 1880, the town of Marshfield didn't just suffer a disaster. For 5 minutes, it ceased to exist. No sirens, no radar. Just a sky that turned the color of a bruised plum, and a wind that drove straws through solid oak. This is the story of the worst 300 seconds in Missouri history. To understand the horror of April 18th, you have to understand the silence that preceded it. You have to strip away your modern comforts. We live in an age of constant noise and constant warning. If a storm forms in Oklahoma, you know about it in New York. You have a smartphone in your pocket that screams at you with a jagged, terrifying alert tone when danger is near. You have Doppler radar apps that paint the sky in reds and greens, showing you the exact rotation of the wind, the exact speed of the hail, the exact street the tornado is traveling down. In 1880, the people of Webster County had none of that. They lived in a world of profound, heavy silence. They had the sky. They had the wind on their cheek, and they had the aches in their joints. Marshfield was not some ramshackle outpost. It was a booming frontier town, the jewel of the Ozarks. It was a place where civilization had finally tamed the wild. The railroad had arrived just 8 years prior, bringing with it the pulse of the outside world. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad cut through the landscape, a steel artery connecting them to St. Louis in the east and the wild territories in the west. It was a town of promise, a town of order, and the symbol of that order was the courthouse. It was the pride of the county, a massive 2-story brick structure that dominated the town square. It was built to last 1,000 years. It was built to say, "We are here and we are not moving." The brick walls were thick. The foundation was deep. It was the place where you went to record your land deeds, to settle your disputes, to register the births of your children. It was the physical manifestation of safety. It was the anchor. Sunday, April 18th, began beautifully. It was the kind of spring day that makes you glad to be alive. The winter of 1879 had been harsh, a brutal season of ice and gray skies. But now, the earth was waking up. The trees were budding with that vibrant electric green of new life. The daffodils were pushing through the soil. The dogwoods were just starting to show their white blooms in the timber surrounding the town. But if you were paying attention, if you were a farmer or a sailor stranded on land, you might have noticed that something was off. The temperature was climbing, not just a gentle spring warming, but a rapid, aggressive spike. By 9 a.m., the dew had evaporated instantly. By noon, it felt like mid-July. The air was heavy, sticky. It was the kind of air you have to chew before you swallow. We now know, with over 140 years of meteorological science, exactly what was happening. A massive tongue of warm, moist air was surging up from the Gulf of Mexico. It was invisible fuel, highly combustible, pouring into the Mississippi Valley. This was a low-level jet, a river of air moving north at incredible speeds, pumping humidity into the plains. At the same time, a cold, dry air mass was punching down from Canada. A sharp, jagged cold front was sweeping across the Rockies, digging into the warm belly of the Midwest. These two giants were on a collision course, and the collision point, the spark that would ignite the powder keg, was Webster County. But in 1880, meteorology was effectively witchcraft to the common man. The word tornado was barely in the vocabulary. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, which handled weather tracking back then, was actually forbidden from using the word tornado in forecasts. They were afraid it would cause panic. They were afraid people would freeze with fear, so they used euphemisms. Severe local storms, high winds. They didn't understand the thermodynamics of supercells. They didn't know what a dry line was. They just knew that it was hot, unseasonably hot. People went to church that morning. The pews were full. The Methodist church, the Baptist church, they were packed with families in their Sunday best. Men in wool suits, sweating in the rising heat. Women in heavy dresses, fanning themselves with hymnals. They sang. They prayed for a good harvest. They prayed for health. They looked at their neighbors and nodded. They had no idea that for nearly 100 of them, this would be their last sunrise. Among them was Dr. W. H. James, a respected man, a man of science in a time when medicine was still finding its footing. He sat in his pew, perhaps thinking about his rounds, perhaps thinking about the strange weather. He had delivered babies in this town. He had set broken bones. He knew the anatomy of the human body better than anyone, but he didn't know that by nightfall he would be testing the limits of his own endurance, sewing wounds by the light of lightning flashes. After church, the town settled into the lazy Sunday rhythm. Families gathered for large dinners, pot roast, potatoes, fresh bread. The smell of yeast and meat drifted from the kitchens. The sound of laughter drifted from open windows. Children played in the yards, chasing hoops, playing tag, completely oblivious to the monster that was assembling in the atmosphere above them. Let's pause the clock here. It is 2 p.m. If you were standing in the town square of Marshfield at 2 p.m., looking up at the courthouse cupola, you would feel safe. You are surrounded by brick and mortar. You are surrounded by friends and neighbors. The concept of total destruction is impossible to imagine. The buildings look solid. The bank looks impenetrable. The saloon, the general store, the livery stable, they are the fixtures of reality. But this is where the trap was set. Disasters like this, they don't just happen. They are built, layer by layer, mistake by mistake, factor by factor. The first factor was the construction. Those brick buildings, the pride of the town, they were unreinforced masonry. They were strong against gravity, holding up heavy slate roofs, but they were brittle against lateral force. They weren't designed to be pushed from the side. The mortar was lime-based, softer than modern cement. Over time, it could degrade. The second factor was the geography. Marshfield sits on a high plateau in the Ozarks. It is one of the highest points in the state. It is elevated, exposed. It is a natural ramp for wind. There are no mountains to block the flow. There are no valleys to hide in. You are up on a pedestal, offering yourself to the sky. The third factor was the time of day. Sunday evening. Everyone was home. Everyone was together. If this had happened on a Tuesday at noon, the men would have been in the fields, spread out. The children would have been at school. The casualties would have been scattered. But on Sunday evening, density is death. Families were clustered in single rooms. It is now 3 p.m. The heat is becoming oppressive. The thermometer is pushing past 80 degrees in April in Missouri. This is unnatural. People are fanning themselves on their porches. The conversation shifts from the sermon to the weather. Awful hot for April, someone says, wiping sweat from their brow. Storm's coming, another replies, rubbing a stiff shoulder. My knee is acting up. I can feel it in the bone. That was the extent of their early warning system. Pain, instinct, the behavior of livestock. Farmers noticed the cattle were restless. They were bunching up, facing the wind. Horses were pacing in their stalls, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Birds stopped singing. The insects, usually loud on a warm day, began to go quiet. Nature knows. Animals sense the drop in barometric pressure long before we do. They can feel the atmosphere changing weight. They can feel the static electricity building in the air. The hair on a dog's back stands up. The birds go to ground, and the atmosphere was changing. The barometer was plummeting. The air pressure was dropping so fast that some people reported their ears popping, like they were descending a mountain. The invisible weight of the sky was lifting, allowing the warm air to explode upward with even more violence. But still, the sun was shining. The sky was blue. This is the cruelty of the atmosphere. It hides its violence until the very last second. It lulls you into a sense of complacency. It's just a hot day, you tell yourself. It's just a spring storm. Now, back to 1880. It is 4 p.m. The light begins to change. Witnesses later described it as a peculiar light. It wasn't just dimming, it was shifting spectrum. The bright, cheerful blue of the afternoon was being replaced by a hazy, sickly yellow. The sun was being filtered through high cirrus clouds, the anvil of the distant storm. Clouds began to gather on the horizon, but these weren't your standard fluffy cumulus clouds. These were towers, hard, crisp, boiling towers of white vapor shooting 40,000 feet into the air. They looked like cauliflower heads made of granite. They were expanding vertically at speeds of over 100 miles per hour. To a modern storm chaser, these are overshooting tops. They are the sign of a thunderstorm so powerful that the updraft punches right through the ceiling of the lower atmosphere, penetrating the stratosphere. They are the engine pistons of a supercell. They indicate that the storm is rotating, that it has a heart, a mesocyclone. To the people of Marshfield, they were just thunderheads, a sign of rain, maybe some hail to dent the crops, nothing to panic about. They simply moved their chairs further back onto the porch. They closed the windows on the west side of the house to keep the rain out. But then, the color shifted again. 5 p.m. This is when the dread started to set in. The yellow haze deepened into a color that many survivors struggled to describe for the rest of their lives. Some said it was green, others said it was purple. One survivor, a young girl at the time, called it the color of a bruised plum. Green sky. If you live in the Midwest, you know what that means. It triggers a primal alarm in your lizard brain. It means hail. Big hail. It means the sunlight is being refracted through millions of chunks of ice suspended in the storm cloud. It means the storm is dense. It is heavy. It is loaded with energy. But in 1880, without the knowledge of severe weather dynamics, it just looked apocalyptic. It looked biblical, like the plague of darkness over Egypt. And then came the wind. At 5:15 p.m., the wind picked up. It wasn't a steady breeze, it was gusty, erratic, hot blasts of air, followed by cold downdrafts. The trees were whipping back and forth. Dust was swirling in the streets, stinging eyes, coating the Sunday clothes in a fine layer of grit. Panic began to flicker at the edges of the town. Mothers called their children inside. "Get in here, now!" The Sunday dinners were cleared away in haste. The mood shifted from lazy satisfaction to high-alert anxiety. Men went out to the barns to check the animals. They found them huddled in corners, trembling. But then, at 5:30 p.m., something strange happened. The wind stopped, completely. It didn't just fade away. It was as if someone had turned off a switch. The trees stood perfectly still. The dust settled. The flags on the courthouse hung limp. The chimes on the porches fell silent. The silence was absolute. Survivors said it was the loudest silence they had ever heard. It was heavy, suffocating. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. It felt like being underwater. This is the calm before the storm. It is a cliché for a reason. It is a real meteorological phenomenon. The storm is inhaling. The massive updraft of the supercell is sucking all the air into itself, creating a vacuum at the surface. The storm is feeding. It is drawing in all the warm, moist air from miles around to fuel its growth. In that silence, you could hear a pin drop in the town square. You could hear the breathing of the person standing next to you. People walked out into the streets, confused. They looked up. The sky was a churning, boiling mess of black and green. But down here, it was dead calm. "Is it over?" someone might have asked. "Maybe it missed us," another might have hoped. They stood on their porches. They stood in the street. They looked west, towards the James River, towards the setting sun. And that is when they saw it. It is now 6 p.m. Survivors reported seeing two distinct clouds. One was a massive dark wall coming from the southwest, the black cloud. It was low, angry, filled with rain and hail. The other was a lighter, whitish cloud coming from the northwest, the white cloud. It was tight, compact, spinning like a top. They were moving fast, much faster than clouds should move. They were racing towards each other, as if drawn by a magnet, as if they were two armies charging on a battlefield. They were converging over the timberland near the James River, just a few miles outside of town. The people watched, mesmerized. It was a spectacle, a clash of titans in the sky. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. And then they collided. The moment the two clouds touched, the sky tore open. Witnesses said it looked like smoke from a massive fire, a gray, swirling mass that dropped from the clouds like a heavy curtain. It began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster and faster. A funnel dropped. It wasn't the skinny, rope-like tornadoes you see in movies. It wasn't a Wizard of Oz twister. This was a wedge, a massive inverted pyramid of darkness. It was wider than it was tall. It looked like the sky itself was dragging the ground. It looked like the thumb of God pressing down on the earth. And the sound began. At first, a low rumble, like a train crossing a distant bridge, a vibration you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. Then, a roar, louder and louder. It sounded like 1,000 freight trains. It sounded like a continuous peal of thunder that never ended. It was a grinding mechanical noise, the sound of millions of trees being snapped, the sound of the earth being chewed up. The silence of 5:30 was gone, replaced by a sonic weapon. The people of Marshfield stood frozen. The human brain has a delay when it sees something it cannot comprehend. It tries to categorize it. Is it a fire? Is it a train? Is it an earthquake? By the time they realized what it was too late to run. There were no storm cellars for many of them. There were no basements in the commercial buildings. There was nowhere to go. The funnel wasn't just moving. It was hunting. It turned. It adjusted its course. It aimed directly for the courthouse. The time is 6:05 p.m. The ticking clock has stopped. 6:05 p.m. The world did not end with a whimper. It ended with a scream. If you have never heard a tornado up close, count yourself lucky. It is a sound that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the primitive part of the brainstem. It is a vibration, a physical pressure that rattles your teeth in your skull. Survivors in Marshfield described it as a continuous crash, not a rumble, a crash, like a train colliding with a mountain. But it never stops colliding. It just keeps crashing and crashing and crashing. The funnel crossed the town line. The first thing to die was the light. As the edge of the vortex hit the outskirts of town, the sun was instantly blotted out. It went from late afternoon to midnight. In 3 seconds, the air was filled with so much dirt, so much pulverized wood, and so much debris that light simply could not penetrate it. You are now standing in pitch blackness, and the wind is screaming at 200 miles per hour. Imagine sticking your head out the window of a NASCAR race car while it is driving through a lumber yard during an explosion. The first houses on the edge of town didn't stand a chance. These were wood-frame structures. They were built with nails and timber. Against an F4 tornado, they were card houses. The physics of what happened next are terrifying. When wind hits a house at that speed, it doesn't just push it over. It interacts with the structure. The wind rushes over the roof. Acting just like the air over an airplane wing, it creates massive lift. In a fraction of a second, the roof wants to fly, but the walls are nailed to the roof. So the walls try to hold it down. The house groans, the wood screams, the nails screech as the friction burns them. And then, snap. The connections fail, the roof lifts off. It peels away like the lid of a sardine can. And once the lid is gone, the walls have no support. They collapse. Or worse, they explode outward. The families inside those houses, they didn't see any of this. It was too dark. They only felt it. They felt the floor drop out from under them. They felt the walls dissolve. One moment, they were in their living room. The next, they were airborne. There is a myth that tornadoes suck you up. That's not entirely true. It is the wind pressure. The wind gets under you. It gets under the mattress you are hiding beneath. It gets under the floorboards. People were tossed like rag dolls. They were thrown into gardens, into fields, into trees. And then the monster reached the square, the courthouse. Remember the courthouse? The symbol of stability? The brick fortress? It was about to face the ultimate test. The tornado hit the square with the force of a tactical nuke. Brick is heavy, but brick is brittle. When a 200-mile-per-hour wind hits a flat brick wall, the pressure is immense. Thousands of pounds of force per square foot. The mortar couldn't hold. The walls of the courthouse didn't just fall. They disintegrated. They turned into shrapnel. Thousands of red clay bricks instantly transformed into bullets. They were flying through the air horizontally. They smashed into the saloons across the street. They smashed into the bank. They smashed into the people who had run into the brick buildings for safety, thinking the brick would save them. It didn't save them. It crushed them. The noise in the square was now beyond human comprehension. It was the sound of a town being put into a blender. Glass shattered, not just broke, but shattered into dust. The air was filled with millions of microscopic shards of glass. If you opened your eyes, you were blinded. If you opened your mouth to scream, you inhaled grit. The trees in the town square, beautiful 100-year-old oaks, were snapped like dry twigs. Others were debarked. The wind was so intense and the debris was so abrasive that it literally sanded the bark off the trees. White skeletons, standing in the dark, stripped naked by the wind. Let's go inside the chaos. Imagine you were there. You are huddled in the corner of your kitchen. You have your arms over your head. The sound is deafening. You can't hear your own scream. The pressure drops. Your ears pop. Painfully. It feels like your head is inflating. The vacuum inside the tornado is sucking the air out of the room and out of your lungs. You gasp for breath, but the air is thin. Then, the wall disappears. The wind grabs you. It feels like a giant hand. Cold, wet, gritty. You are tumbling. You don't know which way is up. You are hit by things. A chair, a branch, a brick, a book. It is a violent, chaotic washing machine of terror and the smell. Survivors always talk about the smell. It smells like pine sap from the shredded trees. It smells like sulfur from the lightning. It smells like wet plaster, and it smells like raw earth, because the tornado is literally scouring the ground, ripping up the grass and the topsoil. It is the smell of the earth being opened up. The tornado tore through the business district. It leveled the drugstore. It leveled the hotel. At the hotel, the guest register was sucked off the counter. It would be found later, 30 miles away, in a different county. That is the power of the updraft. It is an elevator to the sky. But for the people, there was no elevator. There was only the crushing weight of debris. The destruction was indiscriminate. On one side of the street, a house was leveled to the foundation. Nothing left but the stone steps. On the other side of the street, a lamp sat on a table, unmoving. The oil inside hadn't even spilled. This is the chaotic nature of turbulence, the subvortices, little tornadoes inside the big tornado. They act like scalpels, cutting precise lines of death while leaving inches of life untouched. 6:08 p.m. The tornado has been on the ground for 3 minutes. Marshfield is being erased. The noise is still at maximum volume. A constant grinding roar. Fires begin to start. The wood stoves, which had been heating the Sunday dinners, are smashed. The hot coals are scattered into the dry debris. The oil lamps are smashed. The kerosene spills. In the middle of the windstorm, amidst the rain and the hail, fires begin to flicker in the ruins. It is a hellscape. Wind, water, fire, darkness. The cries of the wounded are drowned out by the wind. No one can help anyone. Everyone is fighting their own private war for survival. A mother holds her baby so tight her knuckles turn white. She is buried under a roof. She can't see anything. She can only feel the weight pressing down on her chest. She prays. She screams. But the wind swallows her voice. A man clings to a fence post. His body horizontal in the wind, his feet not touching the ground. He watches his barn dissolve into splinters. He watches his livelihood vanish in seconds. The intensity is relentless. It feels like it has been going on for hours, but it has only been 4 minutes. The tornado is moving northeast. It is grinding its way through the residential section now. The white cloud and the black cloud have finished their dance. They have consumed the town, and then, as quickly as it started, the dynamic changes. The roar begins to shift pitch. It goes from a high scream back to a low rumble. The wind speed drops from 200 to 100 to 50. The heavy debris falls out of the sky. Timber, tin roofs, bricks. They rain down on the survivors. The final insults of the storm. 6:10 p.m. The funnel lifts. Or perhaps it just moved on. It doesn't matter. It is gone. The monster has finished its meal. It exits Marshfield to the northeast, heading back into the timber, searching for its next victim. And then it happens. The most terrifying moment of the entire night. The silence returns. It is not the peaceful silence of the Sunday morning. It is a dead silence, a heavy, ringing silence. The wind is gone. The roar is gone. For 10 seconds, there is absolutely no sound. The birds are dead. The insects are gone. The people are buried. It is dark, pitch black. The clouds still block the stars. There are no streetlights. There are no lamps. Just darkness and silence. You are lying in the mud. You are wet. You are cold. You are bleeding. You push a board off your chest. You sit up. You try to look around, but you can't see your hand in front of your face. You listen. You wait for the train to pass. You wait for the nightmare to end. But the train doesn't pass. The train was the wind, and the wind has left you in a graveyard. You take a breath. The air is filled with dust. You cough. And then the silence breaks, not with a roar, but with a moan, a single voice crying out in the dark. Help! Then another. Mama? Then another. And another. The silence is replaced by the chorus of the dying. The storm is over. The horror has just begun. The silence didn't last long. It was broken by the sound of rain. Cold, freezing rain. The temperature plummeted. Remember that heat? That oppressive 80-degree heat from the afternoon? It was gone, sucked away by the vacuum of the storm. In its place, the cold Canadian air rushed in to fill the void. So now, you are not just buried, you are freezing. The survivors who could move began to crawl out of the wreckage. Imagine that moment. You push a pile of lath and plaster off your legs. You stand up. You reach for your pocket watch, but it's gone. You reach for your wall, but it's gone. You look for a light. There were no streetlights. The gas lamps were smashed. The only illumination came from the lightning that was still flashing in the northeast. The taillights of the monster moving away. And in those flashes, they saw the nightmare. Marshfield was level. I don't mean it was damaged. I mean it was flat. If you stood on the south side of town, you could see all the way to the north side. The visual obstructions, the houses, the stores, the trees, were simply deleted. The first instinct is denial. The human brain cannot process a landscape change that drastic. You think you are dreaming. You think you have walked into the wrong town. Then, the fires started to catch. Small pockets of flame erupted in the debris field. Smashed kerosene lamps ignited splintered wood. And these fires provided the only steady light for the rescue. It was a hellish scene. Survivors moving like ghosts through the smoke and the rain. They were covered in gray mud. Their clothes were torn to shreds by the wind. They looked like the walking dead. John, are you there? Mary, can you hear me? The voices were weak. Shock is a powerful anesthetic, but it also drains your energy. The rescue efforts began immediately, but they were primitive. There were no hydraulic jaws of life to lift the beams. There were no heavy cranes. There were only hands. Men with broken arms tried to lift timbers off their wives. Mothers dug through piles of brick with their bare fingernails until their fingers bled, trying to reach the sound of a crying child. They found the county judge, Judge Fine, buried in his garden. He had been thrown from his house. He was battered, bruised, but alive. He stood up and immediately took charge. He became a general in a war against chaos. But the real war was happening in the ruins of the drugstore. Dr. W.H. James, the man we saw in church earlier, survived. His house was gone. His office was gone. But his skills were intact. He set up a triage center in the mud. Let's talk about 1880 medicine for a second. This is important context. They didn't have antibiotics. Penicillin was 50 years away. They didn't have sterile saline drips. They didn't have x-rays. They had whiskey. They had morphine. If they could find the bottles in the shattered glass, and they had needle and thread, the injuries were horrific. Tornado wounds are not clean cuts. They are degloving injuries. The wind drives dirt, grass, and splinters deep into the muscle tissue. Dr. James and the few other surviving physicians worked by the light of flickering lanterns held by trembling survivors. They were sewing up scalps that had been peeled back. They were setting compound fractures where the bone was sticking out through the skin, covered in mud. They ran out of bandages in the first 20 minutes. They started tearing up petticoats. They tore up shirts. Anything to stop the bleeding. But the biggest problem wasn't the medicine. It was the isolation. Marshfield was an island. The telegraph lines were snapped. The railroad tracks were twisted like pretzels. No one in the outside world knew that Marshfield had been destroyed. Springfield, the big city, was 25 miles away. They had no idea. Someone had to go. A hero emerged. A railway agent, or perhaps just a brave volunteer, managed to find a handcar. Or maybe they ran. Accounts vary, but someone made it to the nearest working telegraph station down the line. They tapped out a message, a distress signal. Marshfield is destroyed. Send help. Send doctors. The message hit the wire. It reached Springfield around 9 p.m. The reaction was instant. A relief train was assembled. Doctors from Springfield grabbed their bags. Nurses jumped on board. They loaded crates of supplies. The train steamed out of Springfield, heading into the dark. Imagine being on that train. You are a doctor. You have heard a rumor that a town is destroyed, but you don't know what that means. You look out the window. It is pitch black. As the train got closer to Marshfield, they had to slow down. The engineer had to watch the tracks. Debris was everywhere. Trees across the line, twisted metal. And then they saw the fires. The train pulled into what was left of the station around midnight. The headlight of the locomotive cut through the darkness like a divine beam. For the survivors huddled in the rain, that light must have looked like an angel. The relief crew stepped off the train, and many of them vomited. The smell was overwhelming, not just the pine and the earth, but the smell of death. They began to load the wounded onto the train. The waiting room of the depot, one of the few things partially standing, became a morgue. They laid the bodies out in rows, covered them with tarps. By morning, the sun rose on a wasteland. April 19th. The sun came up bright and clear. The storm system had moved on to the east. The sky was a mocking, brilliant blue. And under that blue sky, the survivors saw the true scope of the horror. 92 people were dead. Some accounts say 99. Let's put that in perspective. The population was around 1,100. That is nearly 10% of the town gone, instantly. Another 200 were seriously injured. That means nearly 30% of the population was a casualty. Every single family was affected. If you didn't lose a child, you lost a parent. If you didn't lose a parent, you lost a cousin. The cleanup began. It was a grim harvest. They found bodies in the strangest places. This brings us to the anomalies, the forensic mysteries that have fascinated meteorologists for a century. When an F4 tornado strikes, the laws of physics seem to break, but they don't break. They just operate at extremes we rarely see. The straw and the wood. Survivors found pieces of dry straw, fragile yellow grass, driven deep into solid oak trees, like nails. How is this possible? It is a question of inertia and momentum. At 200 miles per hour, the straw has incredible kinetic energy. When it hits the wood doesn't have time to react. The fibers of the wood can't flex or break fast enough. So, for a microsecond, the wood acts like a fluid, and the straw acts like a solid projectile. It pierces the bark before the straw itself can crumple. They found chickens that had been plucked clean of their feathers, but were still alive. This was a common report in old tornado stories. For years, scientists thought it was the air pressure exploding the feathers out of the skin. We now know that is false. It is actually the sheer stress of the wind. The wind grabs the feathers and pulls them out by force. Or, the debris acts like sandpaper. It creates a sandblasting effect that strips the bird naked. And then, the baby. The baby in the tree is the most famous legend of the Marshfield Cyclone. A human infant, found 3 miles away, sitting in the crotch of a tree, without a scratch. Is it true? Probably. Tornadoes have updrafts. They can lift objects gently if the trajectory is right. We have records of Czechs traveling 300 miles. We have records of mattresses traveling 40 miles. A baby is light. If the baby was inside a cradle, or wrapped in a thick quilt, the wind could have caught the surface area of the blanket. Acting like a parachute, the baby glided. It rode the thermal currents of the storm and was deposited gently as the wind speed decreased. It is a miracle of aerodynamics, but for every miracle, there were 10 tragedies. They found the parents of that baby crushed. They found iron wheels from wagons wrapped around tree stumps like rubber bands. They found the massive iron safe from the bank, unlocked by the drop in pressure? No. Smashed open by the impact of hitting the ground after being thrown a block. This is the kind of deep dive analysis we love to do on this channel, looking at the physics behind the folklore. Now, back to the investigation. Why did so many people die? We talked about the brick buildings. We talked about the lack of warning. But there is a psychological factor too. Normalcy bias. People waited too long. When the sky turned green, they stared. When the wind stopped, they waited. They didn't have a mental model for an F4 tornado. They couldn't conceive of it, so they didn't react until the roof was ripping off. The funerals lasted for a week. They dug mass graves. There wasn't enough lumber for coffins. They used packing crates. They used blankets. The town of Marshfield held a joint funeral service in the middle of the wreckage. The preachers stood on a pile of bricks that used to be the church. They read the names. The list went on and on. The legacy of the Marshfield Cyclone is written in the geography of the town. If you go to Marshfield today, look at the trees. You won't find many old oaks in the town square. They are all relatively young, replanted after 1880. Look at the courthouse. The current courthouse is a beautiful building. But it is not the original. It sits on the same spot, a tombstone for the one that fell. But the real legacy is in the science. The 1880 outbreak, of which Marshfield was the centerpiece, changed how we look at weather. It forced the government to stop censoring the word tornado. Within a few years, the Signal Corps began to realize that they had to warn people. They couldn't just protect them from panic. They had to arm them with information. John Finley, a sergeant in the Signal Corps, began the first systematic study of tornadoes because of outbreaks like this. He started mapping them. He started looking for patterns. He was the grandfather of modern severe weather forecasting. So, in a way, the Doppler radar you check on your phone today, the siren that wakes you up at 3 a.m. and saves your life, that technology stands on the graves of the people of Marshfield. They were the canaries in the coal mine. They showed America that the frontier was not just a battle against the land, it was a battle against the sky. The wind eventually died down. The sun eventually rose. The town rebuilt. They swept away the bricks. They planted new crops. Life, as it always does, found a way to continue. But if you talk to the old-timers in Webster County, the ones who heard the stories from their grandparents, they will tell you. They will tell you about the Sunday silence. They will tell you about the green sky. And they will tell you that sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the Ozark Hills, you can still hear it. The sound of 1,000 freight trains, the sound of the clock stopping at 6:05.